Now, I think one of the things you mentioned, which I also agree with, is around application security itself not being this one thing today, right? Today, with the cloud, you have a completely different paradigm that you
Yep.
need to deal with. You have Kubernetes, which is another paradigm, which is now on top of the cloud, sometimes not on the cloud. So, how have you seen this evolve, and where do you see this going? I mean, especially as part of your own work in your own company, but even outside, in terms of industry trends and so on. Where do you see this going? What do you think we're headed towards, especially today, where, I mean, this has definitely increased, but where do you think this is going?
It's hard to say, I think, definitively, but you kind of like almost like a range, right? And the further out you go, the less you're accurate. But what I will say is near term, what I see a lot of is as you've already identified, right? Things like containerization and orchestrating those containers, whether it's Kubernetes or another set of tools that allow you to do that, is going to be that near term space that it's the microservice orientation where you can build something that plugs into this ecosystem, that you can update that thing independently and it doesn't have downstream impacts or negative impacts to the rest of the ecosystem in a way that is really impactful. I think resilience at the end of the day is really the name of the game. It's not that you expect to be perfectly secure. It's that you expect to be able to fix the problem that you've identified as quickly as you can with the least amount of disruption, and then bringing it back into the production ecosystem in a way that now makes it more secure and is continuously and rapidly evolving effectively. To do that at scale is really hard because you have a lot of different teams and a lot of different services interacting with one another. And you really need to have infrastructure as code, meaning you have to have a central place where you're version controlling all of this. And then, of course, you need all of the tool sets that plug into the version control to make sure that the things you're pushing are, in fact, secure. That's, I think, the near term, right? We're going to see a continued drive toward automation, configuration, resilience, and microservices. What I would say is that's not always on the cloud. I think that there are a lot of companies today that are realizing that just lifting and shifting to the cloud for their ecosystem is not the right thing to do from a cost perspective. A lot of the time, companies need to first be able to do that sort of thing in their own data center before they can then realize the benefits of the cloud and all of the security and the resilience that they get from a cloud ecosystem by then being able to go in that direction. But what I see happening after that is, I think, where things get more interesting, because I strongly suspect that as more companies start to really learn and adopt the whole idea of function as a service. So AWS Lambda, Azure Functions, Google has its own iteration of this. And I think that this is something that you can probably emulate at your own data center if you really wanted to. But not only getting the service down to a microservice, but literally going down to just the function, right? And being able to say, I want to just perform this one action entirely separate of the operating system ecosystem, the web transfer ecosystem in terms of whether it's Nginx or Apache or something else, totally separate from the database. And so I think that that's where we're going, right? I think that eventually what will happen is you'll start to see companies that are going to the cloud will actually, instead of taking their entire ecosystem or even the microservice that they've built, they'll start taking functions that they can offload out to the cloud because they're widely used in the ecosystem. They're fairly stable. And to the greatest extent possible, it's actually cheaper to then run it in a way where you're just paying for what you're actually using and not paying for the ecosystem, compute power, storage space, et cetera, that you might otherwise need. And so that's where I think the next step is kind of going serverless, as a lot of people call it. After that, I think things get really interesting though, right? And this is where I'm telling a lot of people to plan for this over the next decade, which is two things. One, quantum computing, and two, general artificial intelligence, or artificial general intelligence. I always forget how they organize that. But we are seeing, especially with like GP3, where they've got this kind of bot or this general intelligence that can take a few words and write like an entire book or news article or what have you fairly natively and convincingly. I think that we are on the cutting edge of really having artificially intelligent systems that work as a concert of artificial intelligence systems, as opposed to just a single large brain of artificial intelligence. And that will really change the game, both from a security perspective, a development perspective, communications perspective, like almost all of it. Because at that point, the human interaction becomes a lot different. And the security interaction becomes a lot different, especially if you have an artificial intelligence system that is now maintaining your infrastructure, your ecosystem, your anything, right, your functions, and is able to patch on the fly based on what it's seeing or what's coming down from the attackers or what have you. And so I think that at that point, what then happens is, after artificial intelligence gets a little bit more robust and quantum computing starts to become a kind of a broader feature set that becomes available, not just in supercomputers out in major data centers, but on people's general systems that they have at home. Probably not to this size anytime soon, but definitely I think down to the desktop level. Is you'll need artificial intelligence to write the programs that can run on quantum computers, because the quantum computers themselves are both true and false at the same time, or it's every iteration of the variable that's possible when it's running things. And human minds think in a very serial way. We know that multitasking is just not something that we're good at. And artificial intelligence will be required to write the programs for computers that are running things in parallel, that are able to multitask effectively. Even today, our computers are all serial based at one point or another. I mean, they might have multiple cores, for example, but each core is running one thing at a time, as opposed to, each core or each processor running just one thing. That's where I think we're going, right? Like, the horizon for that is much further out, maybe a decade, maybe more, maybe a little less, but start learning, learn good artificial intelligence theory now, because I guarantee you the foundations are fairly solid. It will change the game in security, especially as we get to quantum computing. And suddenly, I mean, I think it was last year, 2 or 3 years ago, DEF CON had the entire artificial intelligence systems hacking for one of its CTFs. And it governments are doing that now. Soon it will be more generally available.
No, absolutely. In fact, a couple of interesting points, because I think I saw this. I think it was the 2019 DEF CON, or there was a talk by the Bishop Fox folks on how they used machine learning to actually automate AppSec vulnerability scanning. And outside of that, one of the things, of course, around quantum computing is that I think, at least I'm not a quantum computing or crypto expert, but from what I know, it's going to definitely have huge implications on cryptography, because elliptic curves, which used to be the established best practice in terms of generating the large primes, are now going to be kind of rendered, if not useless, definitely a lot more toothless, if not useless. So that's going to be interesting times where you're not going to be able to necessarily rely on current cryptographic primitives to be able to actually do.
Yeah, we're going to get to a point where we're going to have the immovable or unmovable object versus the unstoppable object, right? It's just like perfect crypto meets perfect security. Like, I don't know. It's going to be a very weird dynamic at that point when we get there. And I suspect it's not as far off as any of us would like. I wonder what will happen first, though, Abhay. The 2038, problem with all of the, system time stuff happening where we run out, it goes all back to zeros, or quantum computing and AI taking over the world. I don't know which one will happen first, but we're heading for another Y2K event in 2038, one way or another.
I think we're getting into territory much beyond our, the industry that we're in. I think the industry itself is not remotely ready for. I don't think we are as an industry ready for this stuff yet. So it's going to be interesting to see how we cope with it, in terms of jobs, in terms of the way we do things itself. So it's interesting.
For sure.
Obviously, so one of the things that obviously I think you need to be living under a rock to not know this, but I think one of the things that you and I both spoke about before we started was the whole supply chain thing, the SolarWinds we had. I mean, we had 2020 kind of ending on a pretty crappy note on this stuff.
Yeah.
Where do you see this? I mean, first of all, where is it? I mean, first of all, is it solvable in the near term? And second, do you see this people actually taking it seriously, or people, like just brushing it off as another, hey, you know what? This is another breach that happened, and that's fine. Let's move on. What kind of response do you see this eliciting, especially from the kind of impact that it's had, which is pretty huge, granted?
Yeah,
So,
the SolarWinds changed the game, right? The whole sunburst attack
Yeah.
completely changed the way that people think about this problem. It's been a problem that has existed for a while, right? Since open source ever became a thing, and since we all started pulling hundreds or thousands of dependencies into our Node.js applications, it's gonna be a problem. It's an ecosystem thing that is going to catch people off guard in really bad ways, and I think that ultimately it gets back to that resilience thing, right? How quickly can you identify that you have a problem, resolve that problem, get it out into production so that you no longer have it in production, and then of course do your incident response activities to determine how vulnerable you are and what sort of problems you need to report on from a legal standpoint, a shareholder standpoint, customer standpoint, etc. But I think it really will. I don't know if it will be the death of open source, because I don't think that that's realistic at this point, given how much open source is now a part of the development process and is helping companies move faster. But I also think that companies need to be much more aware of this in ways that they just haven't been up until now. And so I think that what you'll start to see is it's almost like the microservices of things that you pull in, right? You need to become less dependent on a specific library or a specific product in your tool chain. And you need to abstract away from that and say, I need a feature set that I can buy or utilize or pull in from multiple providers and be able to switch from one provider to the next so seamlessly that your customers don't even know that you've done it, and then go back and do all of your incident response and identification to determine if this was ever really a problem in your ecosystem. So I think that will be the biggest thing that we see investments in from a company perspective, is getting to that point where companies are centralizing their version control on platforms that are scalable enough to support that for their organization will help, right? Having a well-defined set of libraries, whether they're open source or closed source that you've paid for, that your company utilizes, and then having your team keep a very close eye on those, and then centralizing on those services is going to make a very, very big difference in terms of companies' ability to respond to this problem. And so I think that it's, we've seen the tip of the iceberg. We know it's an iceberg given how bad the SolarWinds thing was. And that's just the first, right? Eventually, we're going to see more of this. We've seen it a lot in the Bitcoin space, where people have stolen cryptocurrency or wallets or all of that stuff via all sorts of attacks in this chain. I strongly suspect that the MageCart crew that has gone and got, like, I think it was British Airways or something, is probably playing in this space already, and a lot of people just don't know it, that they're just polluting this tool chain or the supply chain in ways that people don't fully understand yet. But what I will say is, whether or not it's application security, pen testing, you name it, right? Any form of security out there, it's a predator and prey relationship. And what I mean by that is, the predators, the people that are performing criminal activity and are getting out there to get ahead of all of the things that they're hunting, will always evolve faster than the prey, right? In order for them to eat, they need to catch something. The things that need to be caught, they're doing other things to live off the land. And so they don't have to be able to run as fast. They don't have to be able to hide better. So I think that what will happen is, as more regulation comes out, as companies are held to account for these things, as stocks are impacted, as the whole ecosystem starts to change, security will be more invested in. But I also think that security is going to become part of the business in a way that it just hasn't been traditionally, right? I think even now you still see very siloed security organizations compared to the infrastructure teams, compared to the product teams. But thankfully, in certain pockets, you're starting to see this evolution where security is getting closer to the development organization with DevSecOps. They're getting closer to the product organization, whether it's a website, mobile app, physical device that sits on a lab space. They're getting closer to the business. And I often say, or I've often referred to this whole problem as the hospital model, right? Traditionally speaking, and I say this with empathy and love for my security peers, security people have either been ambulance chasers or ambulance drivers. We keep the patient alive and we get them to the hospital, and then it's up to somebody else to actually deal with that. But what we actually need to be is we need to be specialists in the hospital, like the neurosurgeons or the doctors, or or heck, even the nurses, right? Like you have this. If you treated a hospital, except for get rid of all the administration and financial aspect and legal aspect for a moment, and think about just medicine. If medicine was software development, and we were just another practitioner of that, everyone in a hospital, from a nurse to a pediatrician to a surgeon, has a general understanding of medicine. I think at some point, everyone will need to have a general understanding of security and have professionals in that space that are specialists. But I think in the same way, security professionals will need to have a general understanding of software development, because that's how they become part of this ecosystem in an effective way. Otherwise, we continue to be ambulance chasers or ambulance drivers, and all we can do is find the problem, make sure the person gets to the hospital, and hope that it gets fixed.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a very valid point, simply because the way, DevSecOps has definitely driven security teams closer together if done well, right? Now, if done well is a pretty big caveat, but sometimes it's not, and people still want to stick to that. But yeah, I get what you're saying. I think security, one of the points that you mentioned was very nice, which is essentially having a baseline security knowledge, like something like security as safety, right? People understand safety pretty well. So
Yeah.
security as safety, but security as a specialization may be something that I think we need to kind of chase, even with open source or whatever. This was not, of course, only open source. This was a lot of closed source stuff as well.